Welcome everyone to our virtual author presentation with Mark Woods. We ask that you please keep yourself muted until it's time for questions. If you want to chat, there is a chat box option. Just go to the bottom of your screen and click chat. Thank you everyone for coming out. I'm Allison Mon. I'm the Adult Services Manager at the library. Today we will be having Mark Woods. Mr. Woods received the Eugene C. Pulliam Fellowship, where he built his project around the National Park Service. He will discuss his book, Lassoing the Sun, where he spent 1 year exploring the future of our national parks. His plan was to reconnect with the great outdoors, take his mother to a park she had not yet visited, and recreate childhood trips with his wife and their iPod generation daughter. 5 weeks into the year, his mother received a terminal diagnosis, turning the quest into something much more personal. This book is about national parks, truly connecting with family, and the legacies we inherit, and the ones we leave behind. I would like to thank the sponsors for the Friends of the Frankfort Library events. These projects have been made possible through a grant from the Indiana Humanities in cooperation with the National Endowment for the Humanities. Other sponsors include primary sponsors, VFW Post number 1110, an Industrial Federal Credit Union, co-sponsors Encompass Credit Union, and general sponsors Gongwer Powers Insurance and Skiles Electric Incorporated. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Woods.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I wish I could be there with you. I wish I could be in person. I went to college in Indiana. I thought about wearing my my sweatshirt, my Valparaiso sweatshirt. But I live in Florida now, and we've already hit summer. It's not sweatshirt weather. But I was thinking about how our freshman orientation at Valparaiso was at the Indiana Dunes, which is now at Indiana Dunes National Park. So I don't know if I get to count that as a national park I visited, since it was not one of the big national parks at that point. But that was very exciting to hear that. So yeah, I'll tell you, I guess, a little bit about myself and what led to the book, and then kind of walk you through the book a little bit. I'm a columnist at a newspaper in Jacksonville, Florida, and in 2011 I got some email that popped into my inbox about this Eugene C. Pulliam Fellowship, and it's basically gives an award to a writer to take a sabbatical for a year. And I know I deleted it at least once, probably 2 or 3 times before I finally read it, and thought, well, you know, if I got a sabbatical year, what would I do with it? And I looked at the previous winners, and they were pretty heavy topics, you know, pretty much anything you can think of today, whether it was, you know, education or gun violence or world turmoil. And they were kind of things I thought, I'm not sure I want to immerse myself in any of these for a year. If I had a year off, I'd want to go to travel to national parks or something like that, but they'll never give me a fellowship for that. Then it kind of hit me that 2016 was going to be the centennial of the National Park Service. And I thought about Ken Burns' America's Best Idea. That series had come out not too long before that. And Ken Burns and Ansel Adams and John Muir and many people had beautifully documented the history of the national parks. But I had this idea, what if I pitched the idea of what is the future of the national parks? What's going to happen in the next 100 years? So I sat down. I tend to procrastinate. I think it was the weekend before the deadline, wrote out like a 20-page proposal and shipped it off, and I thought I'll never win. And then a few months later, got a call from the judging committee that's called and left a voicemail, and called back. I thought, well, maybe I'm in the running still. I called back and they said, well, you're our winner for next year. So that was a good call to kind of have this golden ticket that all of a sudden I was going to be spending a year in the national parks. And people instantly said, well, A, do you need somebody to carry your bags or take pictures or tag along? And the second thing they would do is tell me, you have to go to such and such a park. And I told them my goal wasn't to go to, at that time, I think there was about 410 National Park Service sites and 59 of the iconic national parks. It wasn't to go to all of them, and it wasn't to go to necessarily the most beautiful ones, although I definitely wanted to hit some of those. I had this plan of 12 parks, one a month. Each one was going to symbolize kind of a different issue for the future. That was how I kind of pitched the proposal, and that was how I envisioned the year. And, you know, if you've read the book, you know, came out very different. Or the intro kind of explained how it changed. But what I want to do is I have this presentation I give, and I want to walk you through that year using the presentation. So let me see if I can do this. So let me walk you through try and walk you through my year. So I win kind of what is this golden ticket of a year in our national parks, and 12 months, 12 parks, each one symbolizing a few kind of something for the future. And I decided to start the year in Acadia National Park in January, and chose Acadia because the place that sunlight first hits the United States each year is atop Cadillac Mountain. So I decided I wanted to be there for the first sunrise, first sunlight of a new year in America. Cadillac Mountain in Maine, which it was a little chilly. That's what sunrise looked like in Maine. I don't know if some of you may have been to Cadillac and experienced that, and even in the summer it can be pretty chilly at sunrise. And they kept apologizing that I wasn't getting a beautiful sunrise, and I said, well, in Florida we get beautiful sunrises all the time. And it was kind of turned everything pink. The rock is already kind of a pinkish granite. The sky turned pink, and I told them it was a very memorable way to start the new year. And then I met two women there who go there to start there every year atop Cadillac, and rode mountain bikes up in the dark, and we rode back down. And this is what it looks like on January 1. If you go there in the summer, there'll be water coming down those walls, but that point it was ice. So then in February, I went to Saguaro National Park. I think partly just to warm up after being in Acadia for January, but partly I wanted to symbolize, you know, and again, thinking in terms of the future, I was thinking of vegetation, what's going to happen with vegetation in the future with climate change and other things. I thought there's only a handful of parks that are named for their vegetation. There's Redwood, Joshua Tree, Sequoia, Saguaro, and Saguaro is kind of this iconic symbol of the West, the cactus. So that was one reason I went there. The other reason was my mom. That's where my mom, after my dad died in 1996, I grew up in Wisconsin and the Midwest mostly, and my mom moved to Tucson, and she fell in love with the desert and passed that love along to me and my two sisters and our children. And so kind of to backtrack, I think often the love of the national parks is something that's handed down from generation to generation, you know, individually from my parents. This is one of my favorite photos of them. Not exactly sure when or where it was taken. I think it was pre-kids because they look young and relaxed and happy. And then three of us came along, and this is how I kind of experienced national parks as a kid. Was we had this pop-up camper that we'd tow behind a station wagon, and my dad was a Baptist minister, but when he was setting up that pop-up camper, there were a lot of swear words said. That's one of my memories of, I don't know if you've seen the movie A Christmas Story, where the dad's fighting with the furnace in the basement. That was kind of, I think that pop-up camper was my dad's version of the furnace. So I have two younger sisters, and I guess my mom decided we needed matching slickers here. And this was a trip to the Redwoods shortly before I began that year in the parks. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it was one of the last trips I would do with my mom. She was 70 something, but she was one of the most active 70 somethings I knew. We'd always joke that keeping up with her on vacation wore us out. So she's there in kind of the blue sweatshirt. But she was sluggish on that trip. And in February, when I went to Saguaro, she had been hospitalized the day before. And when I got there, I went to visit her, and she said, the doctors say I'm dying, that I have months to live, which was hard to fathom, hard to wrap my head around, because she was so healthy and so active. And it instantly kind of changed how I looked at the year. In a lot of ways, it made me, what I was doing seem less important, but then quickly it also became more important, because my love of the parks could be traced, like I said, to my parents, to my mom. And she said she wanted me to continue on this. She was very excited about it, very proud of it. And I did, but I tweaked it. I kind of stayed in the Southwest early in the year. So in March, I went to Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, which is basically where the Colorado River, before it hits the Grand Canyon. And we flooded Glen Canyon. It's no longer, there's only a portion of it left. So I wanted to think about what we've done with the Colorado River there, and think about water in the West was one of the issues I wanted to think about. But also, this is a place, a few years before that, I had whitewater rafted with my mom. So a lot of these parks kind of had these threads where I think my project started out as this journalistic project, but quickly became even much more personal, and the places became much more personal. Spent part of that month with at this place at a weekend with river guides that were preparing to guide on the Grand Canyon that year. And they don't go to for their annual convention, they don't go to a Marriott in Phoenix or something. This is where they go. And it was really fun and interesting to spend a weekend with them. And this is the Navajo Bridge there, right? Basically kind of the start of the Grand Canyon, and the night skies are just stunning there. And that's one thing I thought about it often during the year, is how night skies are an important part of the equation of when you visit a national park. I have vivid memories of a kid going to ranger talks and camping and seeing the skies. And, living in a city, we don't see night skies like we used to. And that's something the National Park Service is working to preserve. You don't think of we think of preserving water or animals or vegetation, but they're working on night skies, which I love that, because that's one of my favorite part of every national park experience is the night skies. In April, I went to Grand Canyon National Park, partly because that's one of my favorites and I wanted to include it. So, but also kind of continuing down the Colorado River. And I met with the superintendent there, and he talked about how he'd been handed the keys to one of the most protected places on earth. But what does he spend every day doing? And I said, I don't know. He said, trying to protect it. And his point was that just because we create a national park, it's not preserved forever. It's not like you get to lock it up and throw away the key. It's basically a day by day, year by year, generation by generation. You have to preserve places like these, otherwise we'll lose them. So that was one of kind of my epiphanies from the year, and one of the things I think about when I go back to the Grand Canyon. Hiked down to the river there, and I bumped into this family with this little boy. They said a boy named Blue. His name was Blue, and when I got close to him, you could see his eyes were about as blue can be. And he was so happy. He was going, I'm going to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And I thought, well, if I'm looking for the future of the National Park Service, national parks, I could do worse than a boy named Blue. Got down to the bottom to the river. I saw them when they were down there, and he was still all upbeat. And I said, did he hike this whole way? And they said, oh no, he was asleep and on our shoulders, but they carried him all the way down. And I thought, that is going to be one of those memories. I don't know. I think those kind of things embed and sink in with you, because my parents, I think, did nothing as epic as that kind of hike, but all these little hikes in the redwoods and things where they'd have to bribe us with M&Ms and we'd be complaining. But I think those trips sink in a way that come back years later. May, I went to the Dry Tortugas National Park, which is about 90 miles off of Key West in Florida. And it's kind of somewhat polar opposite to Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is this arid Southwest with a strip of water running through it. Dry Tortugas is 100 square miles of water with just 7 tiny islands and less than 100 acres of land. But it's this place with, it has this history of shipwrecks and pirates and Hemingway, and it just feels like something straight out of a novel. So I kind of wanted to go there. And it has this fort, one of the largest forts America ever built in the 1800s. And to me, that they built this, I think the statistic is 18 million bricks took to build it. And they built it out there 90 miles from Key West. That feels like, to me, almost that century's version of sending a man to the moon. Like, how did they build this? And architects to this day kind of still marvel about the fort there. So you can either take a ferry or you can fly out there by plane. I took the ferry, and all you see is water and water and water, and all of a sudden you see the fort appear in the distance. I went here partly to think about climate change. There's lots of different, I thought you could go to Glacier National Park and talk about the receding glaciers. But what I liked about this, or you could go to the Everglades here in Florida. Somebody described that as ground zero. I think Dry Tortugas might be even below ground zero then, because there's, I asked one of the rangers there, what do you think will be here in 25 years? And the water's already coming kind of up over this moat and it's kind of destroying the fort a little bit. But he said, and I said, what about in another 100 years? And he said, oh, I don't think any of us will be out here, and we'll be doing dives here, which may be a slight exaggeration. So I camped out there. I tried to camp wherever I could. And there's campsites right next to the fort. And it was when we were having a super moon. So this big giant moon would rise on the horizon, and during the day there's hundreds of tourists out there, visitors, but at night most people go back, and you have the place to maybe you and about a dozen other campers. So it's a very memorable experience to be out there at night. The place for snorkeling, the water looks like that. Took this picture on the dock because there's a guest log, and I took it because of the last one at the bottom. It was somebody from Bordeaux, France, that said, I'm not going to try and pronounce it in French, but it said, what that translates to is paradise on earth and God bless America. And you especially in the summer when Europeans are on holiday, you tend to bump into a lot of foreign visitors in our national parks, and they would often ask me, do Americans know what you have in your national parks? They'd say, I don't think you can compete with us for castles or art or old buildings, but your national parks are as good or better than anything we have. And I'd tell them, I think some Americans appreciate that, but not all. And that's kind of one of the big fears for the future is, will America and will Americans appreciate their national parks? June, I went to Yellowstone National Park, the world's first national park in 1872. So it just this summer, or just recently, celebrated its 150th anniversary. And from the beginning, I wanted to include Yellowstone. I went there as a kid with my parents, and it's kind of funny. I remember other places, other national parks too, I went to as a kid. I can picture so vividly, but I couldn't picture Yellowstone. And I asked my mom about that before I went there, and she said, well, I think that's because we just kind of zipped through there, and it was more like a checking it off a bucket list. We saw Old Faithful erupt and we went on. So I wasn't really even that excited about that. I was thinking more, it's just I'll go there, I need to go there. But this trip, I spent 2 weeks there, and I have to say, it's not just world's first national park. It's one of the best national parks in the world. It has, it has what we think of the geysers. It has mountains. It has valleys. It has waterfalls. I went there partly to think about the bison. 100 years ago, there was down to about a dozen bison of this historic Yellowstone herd, I mean. And now there's about 4,000 bison. So the bison have become actually an issue. How do, when they leave the park, what should be done with them? And you have competing thoughts, some that think they should roam wherever they want. Others think they basically should be shot when they leave the park, or that should be an option. And so it's an interesting conservation dilemma now, the bison. So we were setting up our tent there, and that was one of the trips my daughter, who was I think 9 at the time, did with me and my wife, and setting up the tent. And my daughter said, "Daddy, there's a bison outside." And I thought, "Oh, sure." And because she would joke a lot, she'd say, she'd come home from school and say, I got an F on the test, and just kidding, I got an A. So I thought she was kidding, but I poked my head out the tent window, and sure enough, there was this bison wandering through the campground. Which, if you've been there, you find them everywhere. You can get stuck in bison jams. I like how this, I think it's been taught well. It looks both ways before crossing. So that's my daughter in front of Old Faithful. And my wife, on that trip, my wife and daughter flew back to Florida, and I stayed there for longer. I was interviewing rangers and trying to work on my project, and I called my mom's house in Tucson, and my sister said, I'd been going back and forth between there. She said, "I think you better come to Tucson." So instead of flying back to Jacksonville, I flew to Tucson, and my mom's health in June of that month deteriorated very dramatically. And on June 30th of that year, she died. And she had asked that we don't have a big church service. I don't know why. She went to church every Sunday, but so we kind of honored that request. We did not have a big service in a church. We had something this is the visitor center at Saguaro National Park, where she volunteered. So one sunrise, we had a church service there, and the pastor, we suggested we go for a walk through the desert and just listen to the desert. My mom was, she's a very quiet person. We hiked with her. You would just listen to the desert. So I think she appreciated that. So that was June 30th. And I sometimes think about how that almost divided the year in two. The first half was, how do you deal with losing someone, a loved one? The second half was, how do you move forward after losing someone? And for me, in both of those cases was natural space, the natural parks. I had planned in July to go to Denali with my mom. She had never been to Denali in Alaska, and we were going to do that. I decided I just wasn't up for that to go right away. So instead, I basically did almost the exact opposite, I guess. I had also wanted to include an urban park, because part of the National Park Service mission for the centennial was, they'd talk about how if the first century was bringing people to the parks, in the next century, they wanted to bring parks to the people, and they wanted to have more good urban parks. And somebody I talked to from the National Parks Conservation Association said, you should go to Gateway National Recreation Area in New York City. You can camp there. I said, I can camp in New York City? And they said, yeah. So I made that my trip for July. Wasn't quite what I expected. Here, if you look, you'll see the sign for campgrounds, and you also see at the bottom of that sign, NYC Sanitation Training Center. So this is Floyd Bennett Field is in Brooklyn. And it used to be in the 1920s, it was one of New York City's first airports. But it really was hard to get to then, so it never quite succeeded. They had some famous flights. Wrong Way Corrigan took off from there, kind of in that golden era of flight. But it didn't survive as a city airport. But in the 1940s, it became a military airport and was one of the busiest airports in the world. And then after World War II, again, just kind of sat there until 1972, became handed to the National Park Service. So they're trying to figure out, what do we do with this land? And it's got these huge tarmacs there. There's the Sanitation Training Center. Across that, in those trees, is the woods where the campground is. That's my camp, my tent. I think I have a recording. I don't know if you'll be able, hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
This is the sound of the campground Gateway National Recreation Area.
So if you could hear that, that was first night. All I'm hearing is these planes that feel like they're coming about 30 feet over the tent, one after another, because it's just across Jamaica Bay from JFK Airport. And so I'm already kind of thinking, what am I doing here? And then the mosquitoes were worse than anywhere. And this is the RV campsite, which was bleak. Here's some of the old hangars. And I'm starting to think I could have been in Glacier. I could have been in Olympic, all these beautiful national parks. What am I doing here? I was questioning it. One of the rangers showed me this beach that they called Bottle Beach because a landfill had broken, and said, we take school groups here. I said, what? And he said, well, we want to show them that when you throw something away, it doesn't just poof, disappear. It has to go somewhere. So there was a message there, but I'm still wondering, what am I doing here? But they've taken one hangar and kind of turned it back into 1920s era. You feel like you've stepped back into time. They've converted another hangar into a recreation area. One of the lead rangers who grew up there in Brooklyn talked about how nature is coming back to this place. And he drove me around and he said, look at this field, isn't it beautiful? And I guess my face didn't, he said, you don't see it, do you? I said, no. And he said, you just see a bunch of weeds, right? And he said, well, let's go out in the weeds. So he was showing me what was there. And he said, this isn't Yellowstone or Yosemite, but this is New York City of 100 years ago. And we have wildlife coming back that hasn't been here in a long time, with plants and flowers and vegetation. And I went kayaking in Jamaica Bay. And as that week went on, I started to think about how important urban spaces like that are, and also about something my mom and my dad both were very good wherever they lived. They were good about finding nature in their backyard. So that was a challenging trip, but it's one I think about often. It's a park I think about often. And they had lots of plans for changing it. So it's one I want to get back to and see what happened with it. August, I went to Yosemite National Park, kind of thinking in terms of loving your park to death. If there's an example of that, it's Yosemite Valley in the middle of summer. But I didn't really want to think about traffic and something kind of like boring like that. I wanted to focus on how 100 years ago, nobody was climbing those rock walls of Yosemite, of El Capitan. But now the rock walls literally get crowded. So I went there and talked to climbers. This is the head climbing ranger, kind of asking him, what do you think is going to happen here in the next 100 years? While I was talking to him, a bear walked behind us. He didn't seem too worried, so I didn't seem too worried. Did not climb El Capitan like Alex Honnold and Free Solo or anything, but I did climb up the side of Half Dome. There's cables there, and to me that was, to the real rock climbers, those cables would be nothing, but to me they're still pretty daunting. It's about a 45-degree angle, and you can see the people going up there, and my palms still get sweaty just looking at it. People up on the top of Half Dome, Roten Rocks, it ain't easy. September, I went to Flight 93 National Memorial. I wanted, a lot of our national parks are about history, and I wanted to include something that was about history. I thought about Gettysburg or Antietam, a Civil War site, but I was kind of determined I was going to do Flight 93, partly because it's different kind of history. It's something all of us remember, 9/11, but 100 years from now, this place will be telling the story of Flight 93. So how do you build a site? It's kind of, how do you build a new National Park Service site? So that was one reason I wanted to go there. The other is Richard Guadagno. This you see the names of the passengers here. Richard on the left. His sister lives here in Jacksonville, Florida, and I got to know her probably 10, 15 years ago, not long after 9/11, and went with her and her family, her parents, to Flight 93 for several anniversaries, because Richard was her brother and only sibling. So in the context, I had already planned to do this as part of the story and tell Richard's story. He was a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Ranger, so he was the only Department of Interior employee on that plane. And there's now a U.S. Game Lands right across the street from Flight 93 that has his name on it. And Lori talks about, I don't know if any of you remember, but before Flight 93 went down there, it was basically this abandoned strip mine. And she talks about when she went there immediately afterwards, it was one of the bleakest places on Earth. And not just because a plane crashed there and her brother died there, but because she said it was basically stripped of all living things. So she hated going there and thought she never would want to go back. That's a rock marking the spot where the plane crashed. A ranger does a talk where he talks about Richard. Now it's 2,000 acres, and nature has kind of reclaimed that space. I shouldn't say kind of, it very much has. It has a beauty of rolling Pennsylvania hills. They've had lots of wildlife coming back, everything from birds to bears. And it has the memorial itself is this stark wall. So you have this kind of beautiful man-made feature to this memorial, but also the nature around it is part of the memorial. And Lori talks about how now she loves going back there. It's a place where she can find solace. And I think that's a huge part of national parks. And, I told her that's what I was doing as I was grieving that year and losing my mom. And I thought about how she never got to say goodbye to her brother and what that place means to her. So I wanted to tell his story and the story of Flight 93. In October, I went to Olympic National Park, and I went there to think about sound. Guy's name is Gordon Hempton. He's won Emmys. He calls himself the sound tracker. He's won Emmys for recording natural sound. And in the 1980s, and in the whole rainforest, he created this spot that he calls the 1 square inch of silence. And his mission in life, some people, try and fight to save such and such an animal or tree. His is to save natural sound. He argues that there's only about a dozen places in America where you can go and during the day you can be there for 15 minutes and not hear man-made sound. And when he first told me that, I thought, I don't believe that. But during the year, it is really hard to go. And since then, it's really hard to go somewhere and not hear man-made sound. So I asked him, can I go to the whole rainforest and hike out to the 1 square inch of silence, this kind of place he's made this symbolic epicenter for fighting that battle. So I did that with him. And if a plane passes over, he records the sound, he writes down the time, the date, and he writes letters to the airlines. And he's trying to basically make Olympic the first sound natural park in the world, I guess. So this is Gordon at the 1 square inch of silence. And I camped in the rainforest. It rained at the time I was in Olympic that week. It rained all week until the one night I camped in the rainforest, and it stayed dry that night. November, my mom had this camper van. It was kind of her prized possession that she drove all over the country, drove to Jacksonville, drove to Yellowstone, drove to the Redwoods. She asked us if any of us wanted it, and all the 3 kids said, no, we don't have anywhere to keep it. But when I was in Yellowstone, I thought, I think I want Mom's van. So I called this is before she had passed away. I called Tucson and I told my sister, tell mom, I think I want the van. And she said, my mom got a big smile. So I think she was happy that I was going to take it. So that November, Thanksgiving, my sisters and I gathered in Tucson. We scattered my mom's ashes, and I hopped in the van and started driving cross country. My family all flew back. One of my friends joined me on that trip. The first night we drove to El Paso, and there really wasn't any campgrounds there. And we were just gonna stay in a Holiday Inn, and my wife said, "What? You have the camper van? Aren't you gonna stay somewhere?" And we're like, "Okay, I guess we could stay in." I heard you can stay in Walmart, so we did that. So again, this was Thanksgiving. I flew, so this is the day after Thanksgiving, Black Friday. Didn't think that out. It was kind of pure chaos in a Walmart on Black Friday, but a memory in its own way, I guess. Hopefully I made up to it for my friend who did that trip with me the next night, because we camped in Big Bend in what's called Chiso Space, and somewhere down in there is the camper van. And it was kind of quite the contrast with if the El Paso Walmart was crazy, this was very peaceful. Continued on all the way back to Jacksonville. And then December, that was the 1 month, even at the start of the year, the start of the project, I never really knew where I was going to finish. I had all these different ideas. Do I circle back to Acadia? Do I go to Denali for my mom? But I decided I didn't really want to be in Alaska in December. And at some point, somebody had joked, well, you started with the sunrise in Acadia. You're going to finish with the sunset in Maine, in Hawaii. And the more I thought about it, well, I could. And I looked, there's Hawaii volcanoes. There's several national parks in Hawaii. But I started looking at Haleakala in particular. Haleakala on Maui is the dormant volcano that covers about 2/3 of the island. And Haleakala, it means house of the sun. So I started thinking, that hit me. You could see a little car there down at the bottom. Mark Twain visited there when he was a young man and wrote that sunrise there is one of the most sublimest spectacles he'd ever seen. And even as an old man, he still talked about Haleakala. And it was a place that was created in the week I was born, the week my parents became parents. And it was created as a national park. And it has all these endangered species. So bit by bit, I started to think, well, this is maybe where I should go. And then I read the local mythology of the story of Haleakala. And there's the story of the demigod Maui, this little boy Maui, whose mother said she didn't have enough time to get all her chores done. So the little boy climbed up to the top of the volcano one day and waited for the sun to come over and lassoed the sun, pulled it down and said, I'll let you go if you promise to slow down when you pass over the volcano at this spot. And the sun agreed. So the local mythology is that the sun slows down as it passes over Haleakala. So I thought, okay, a boy lassoing the sun for his mother, and the end of the year, I didn't really want it, as much as I love my job, didn't really want this year to end. So I thought, okay, I guess I'm going to Haleakala. This feels like it was meant to be. So I went there, and on December 30th, hiked into the crater. This is my campsite down in the bottom of the crater, which is considered one of the quietest places on earth. And it's a different quiet than the 1 square inch of silence, which had all this natural sound. It's an absence of quiet almost, eerily quiet. It makes you uncomfortably quiet. So I spent the night there, woke up, hiked out, went back to the rim for the final sunset of this calendar year. So I watched the sun head off into the distance, and it did feel like it lingered and lingered and lingered, like it was had slowed down. And I kind of took comfort in knowing that in a few hours it would be getting to Maine and Acadia and Cadillac Mountain, and my friends Lily and Carol, the women I met at the start of the year, would be there to greet it and start another year. So that is the story of lassoing the sun. So let me see if I can go back to stopping the share. And hopefully I'm back to you. Are you there? Hello?
Hello.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So that's the story of my year. And I apologize so much. I should have tested out that beforehand. I apologize, and hopefully you were able to see all that and get a sense of what the year was and why the parks mattered to me. And I'd be happy to answer questions. And I really appreciate you inviting me and listening to me ramble. My dad used to do these when they'd go on vacation, do these slide throw shows with these kind of clunky slide projectors and have all the neighbors over, and he'd have a zillion pictures of flowers. And I sometimes feel like I hope I'm not doing my dad's slide shows where he's just rambling for an hour and making him watch vacation photos. So I really thank you and appreciate it. If you have questions, please fire away.
If anyone has questions, you can either unmute yourself, or if you don't want to use your audio, you can type it into the chat and I will read it out loud. From Linda, my granddaughter graduates from college Saturday, but plans to take a year off working at national parks.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I wish, you talk about regrets. That probably one of my regrets is that when I was in my 20s, when you have that freedom, that I didn't try and do, a summer of just working a seasonal job. A lot of the park rangers almost have those kind of stories where I went to Yellowstone for a summer, and next thing I knew, 40 years later, I've been in the Park Service since then. And I mean, I love my job, but I think if there had been some other path, it would have been something like that. My wife and daughter joke that I want to be a park ranger. And that's one thing I did appreciate about that year was I kind of was almost afraid. That was one of my fears, like, oh, you get close to something and your love of it maybe fades. I was a sports writer for 20 some years, and some of the sports I covered, I don't watch anymore that much, because it's almost like you've seen behind the scenes and you kind of burn out on them. That did not happen with the national parks, where I love the national parks every bit as much as I did beforehand. And my respect for the people who work in them is even greater. The rangers and the administrators. And so I have tremendous amount of respect for everybody there. And that was one of the joys of the years, having an excuse to go to a park and say, can I spend a half day with a biologist or whoever? So good luck to your granddaughter. I think that I'm sure it will be an amazing experience.
The focus of your time off was to study the future of the national parks. What are some of the key ideas or lessons you learned about their future? That's from George.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I touched on it a little bit before, that one of the epiphanies kind of felt like, I think before this, I always thought when we preserved these places that we had preserved them kind of forever. That was what creating a national park did. And it kind of opened my eyes that it doesn't. You have to do it again and again, day after day, and generation after generation, both. And so when people ask, what can you do to help the parks, I usually just say, go to them, because I think they work their magic, and take somebody with you, and even better, take somebody from the next generation with you. And I think they'll fall in love with it, and they'll become passionate, because if Americans don't care about their national parks, then they won't be protected, because they won't have that support. But as it stands, it's, I think that National Parks Conservation Association did a poll a few years ago, and I forget what the question was, but it basically was asking in general support of the national parks, and it had a 95% yes support. And I've said in this era, I don't think there's much that we agree on 95%. So that to me is pretty profound, that our parks are one of those things that they're bipartisan, they're all parts of the country. They're just a beloved institution that a lot of people will support and fight for. So.
Okay, from Dennis, what is your favorite national park and why?
Okay, yeah. I love asking that question to others. So I sometimes happy to hear what yours are too. But I always say you can't pick one. But I eventually needed to come up, I guess, with an answer. So I kind of cheat and I kind of say a couple. I tend to say Redwood and Grand Canyon. And I think when I ask people that question, I realize it's partly what you find in the parks, partly the beauty, but it's also partly your personal experiences, who you went with, when you went in your life. And I have these experiences both from childhood and adulthood. Redwood, I think, was my first national park. Grand Canyon was one of my first, and I've gone back to both. So I think those are my two. And then beyond that, it hit me at one point, there's something about those parks, they're very different, but there's something similar about them, is that they both make you feel very small. You stand next to, the largest, tallest living organisms on Earth, 300-foot trees, you feel very small. They're 2,000 years old. You feel very small. You go to the Grand Canyon and the layers of rock that are, I think the bottom layer is 1.7 billion years old, and it's 10 miles across, a mile deep. So both time and space, you feel small. And I find that actually feels pretty good. We get wrapped up in worrying about little things in life and fretting about there. And you go there and you think, I'm just a speck in time, a speck on this planet. And there's something almost, I think, very liberating about that. And I find that very comforting. So that's my long answer to though. I think those are my two favorite.
One from me, what park is on the top of your visiting bucket list?
Okay. I probably should say one that was on the top very high was Denali, because as I told you, I'd planned to go there with my mom. Since I wrote the book, I did make it to Denali two summers ago. Well, it was before the pandemic, so I guess it must have been 2019. And just happened, this was not even planned, to be at Denali at the visitor center on my mom's birthday. So I was able to get my national park passport stamped with a Denali stamp on, with my mom's birthday in it. So that was very high on my list. Now I would say I still haven't, going back to when I won this, a lot of people said you have to go to, one of the ones I heard often was Glacier, that people say it's one of the most beautiful ones they've been to. I still have not been to Glacier. So that one I think is really, really high on my list. North Cascades out in Washington, Isle Royal, and I grew up in the Midwest, and that's up in Lake Superior. My mom and dad spent one of their anniversaries out on. It's another one where you have to take a ferry out there. I'd really like to get out there and spend a week on Isle Royal. So I think those three might be among high on my to-do list.
George says you must go to Glacier.
I've heard that again and again. Yeah. Everybody says it's the mountains and the lakes. The kind of have these mountain lakes up there. It just looks like a storybook. So that is high.
Do you have any advice for anyone looking to make their first trip to a national park?
I would say if you're thinking of the big iconic ones, plan ahead, because it's pretty ridiculous how far things book, whether it's camping, hotels. So you really need to. I've gotten to the point where in like January and February, like I booked things for Yosemite for this coming fall. I'm not even sure I'm going to go there, but I knew if I waited till May or June, I'd have no shot at it. So I have a lot of the reservations you can make you can cancel. So what I tend to do is I think I might want to do this or this. So I try and make reservations early in the year, and then hopefully make that happen instead of, more traditionally, I'd probably, be doing it all at once in, May or something about now. So that would be my advice. If you're going to one of the big ones, plan way ahead. But then the second one is some of the lesser known ones are stunning. Some of the national monuments are not nearly as visited, but are as beautiful and historic and powerful. But because they don't have national park as part of their name, they don't have the visitation. Like, I mentioned Indiana Dunes. I've read how visitation has skyrocketed in the last couple of years. Once you have that label, it's not that the park itself has changed much, but once you have that, you become this destination. So I'd say also look at some of the national monuments and consider some of them. There's some really beautiful ones.
All right, does anyone else have questions?
Mark, if I can jump in for just a second.
Of course.
Your story is pretty much my story here. My parents passed on that same love by pulling a pop-up camper behind a station wagon. And I'm happy to say that both my parents are on the Zoom meeting right now. They're in Frankfort. I'm actually in another town here. And I was blessed to be named the National Park Ambassador in the centennial year because I do a lot of national parks curriculum in my classroom. So I have basically in the last decade visited 400 of the 423 sites.
Wow.
And shared curriculum with a lot of rangers. So like you, I've been able to talk to a lot of rangers and just develop such an appreciation for them. And so I just preface that to say I've had many of the same experiences you've had doing the same kind of research you have. And I'm curious to see, you have hit on both sides of the argument, even in your presentation in just the last few minutes beyond your presentation you gave tonight, where the double-faced mission of the Park Service is to provide enjoyment for the people, but preserve it for the future generations. And those are in stark contrast to one another, that you can't do both at the same time. And every ranger confesses that. And so as you were talking to them, which side of the aisle do you see the majority of them leaning to? Is it to try to pull back, to go more on the preservation route, or is it still to bring more people to the parks? Because a lot of the parks are basically being loved to death. Especially the most iconic ones. And because we keep adding more parks to the system, budgets are getting smaller and smaller. And I know I've talked to a lot of rangers who say they want to stop naming more national park sites and you actually turn a lot of them back over to the state so that they can keep their funds going for the major tourist destinations. So what have you found in your talks with them, without giving away too much of the book? But
Right. No, yeah. I'd love to hear what your favorite parks are. Yeah, no, that was definitely, I was fortunate enough because of the fellowship that allowed me, I was able to go up to Washington, D.C. and meet with Jonathan Jarvis, was the head of the Park Service of that. And he talked about that, we have a mission unlike any other government agency, that, it's such a contradictory mission. But it also seems, I think maybe that yin and yang serves the parks well. It doesn't, if you can somehow balance it, that they don't go one extreme or the other. He talked about how he hated the phrase "loving our parks to death," because he felt like, we can find ways to manage people and manage visitation. He said his bigger fear was we don't love the parks enough. Bigger fear for the future was that we don't love the parks enough. And if that happens, he said, then we've got real problems. But it is a perpetual balancing act. And you're right. You watch the rangers, they want others to love these places and to come and visit, but then they also want them to make sure they're not destroying them. And which is in the busy ones is a challenge, that they're, people are doing things that are harmful to these parks. So yeah, you think of a place like Yosemite or Yellowstone or Acadia, several of the ones that were in my 12, that definitely is their constant battle. And yeah, I don't know if I found rangers tilting one way or the other. I think if you were in the busy parks, they were maybe trying to tilt toward how do we preserve these places, because they weren't worried about the parks not being loved enough. But if you were in a quieter place, it might tilt the other way, I guess. But yeah, I did also hear, I remember the superintendent of Acadia said he would favor shrinking the park system instead of, unless we're going to, dramatically increase the budget. If we're not going to do that, he said, I'd rather us shrink it and make sure we protect what we have and we do it right. There's a lot of parks you go to, it's kind of surprising how some of their amenities have deteriorated over time. I didn't even put this in the book, but somebody from National Parks Conservation Association had told me about Little Bighorn, Battle on Little Bighorn, that unit, how they had this really old visitor center that leaked when it rained, and all this pieces of American history were being destroyed down in their visitor center. So they transported it all to this this warehouse, that archival type warehouse in Tucson, Arizona. I said, really? My mom lives in Tucson, Arizona. So I went to this giant, I say warehouse, but it's a museum grade space where it feels like Raiders of the Lost Ark, with just rows and rows of pieces of American history there, but they're just trying to preserve it. But that was kind of, to me, a great example of it, that they didn't have the funding to have a visitor center at Little Bighorn that could preserve that stuff. So they literally moved it, and that had upset some of the tribes because it had some of their materials. But the Park Service kind of made this tough call that we just need to somehow save this stuff so it doesn't keep deteriorating. So budgets are a huge issue. The Great American Outdoors Act being passed last year hopefully will help some, but it seems like kind of a perpetual battle. So Jeff, what are your favorite parks? Can you tell me yours, since you've been to, I think I've been to 150 maybe. I've still got, and maybe 30 of the 63 or whatever it is now. So,
well, I ranked them one time all the way through all 400 that I visited, and I find every time I go back to that list, things are getting flip-flopped around. It's a matter of one time a site might impress you beyond belief when you drive in, but then the next time you visit, okay, the wonder's over. Whereas other places, the more you keep going back, the more things you discover. The one that really rocketed me on my particular quest was Chaco Culture National Historic Park in New Mexico. That's where my award-winning photograph was taken that won me the ambassadorship. And that's one of those sites that I would immediately name a national park, but then starting to talk to rangers, I don't want it to ever be a national park for that very same reason.
right.
It's so remote, you can't get back to it unless you really want to make that charge to do it through really rough roads across Navajo land. To get there, I would never take anything but a rental car to do it. And I keep thinking, if it was a national park, suddenly you'd have 1 million people in RVs coming back here and destroying a sacred area. But as far as the 63 national parks, your bucket list is exactly what you need to have, because I have Glacier as number one of all the national parks.
Wow. Okay.
Between the scenery, between the wildlife experiences that my wife and I have had up there, literally making contact with a grizzly, literally making contact with a bighorn sheep on a trail. It's just phenomenal. The wildlife up there is incredible.
And what month would you go? Because I've heard same kind of things you hear with other popular ones, that certain months it just gets crowded. So it seems like you want to, but you can't go too far to the shoulder seasons because you can't hike. So
Yeah, early June would be the very earliest you could go, but even then you're putting your tent probably on a snowbank, and some of the trails are still shut. You're going to have to go after the 4th of July to be safe. The prettiest time for the park is probably late August, but I've never been there because I teach and can't get off then. But I know the alpine prairies and things are just absolutely extraordinary with the wildflowers and things in the late August.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
hope you get a chance to go sometime.
Yeah, it is high on my list. Yeah.
And you can see my parents there on the other screen.
I can, yeah. No,
They're the one that imparted that love of parks, both at the state level and the national level to me. And I thank them immensely for that rich legacy they passed down to me. So
yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, I think I say this in the book, and I know I've said it, just how the kind of thing you don't really appreciate when you're a kid. And, you know, my parents didn't have a ton of money. My dad, a minister, my mom, a social worker and teacher. And, but I realize now, wow, those trips they gave us were, I mean, I wouldn't trade those for anything. They were special experiences. And like I said, I can picture the campsite in the Redwoods where we camped, I think, because it was such a powerful experience. And I didn't that pop-up tent camper slept 4, so I got to sleep in a pup tent like 10 feet away from that or whatever. And I think that felt like super adventurous and independent. And I'm out in my little tent. And so I can picture being in that tent at age, I don't know, whatever, 8, 9, 10 years old. And that would just felt very liberating. But I can vividly see that campsite. So yeah. So yeah, I'm sure. Hopefully, yeah, my daughter loves Disney and is kind of a theme park girl. But hopefully, some of these I know some of the national parks experiences have sunk in with her too. So Allison, does anybody else have a?
I'm not seeing any more pop up.
Well,
so
yeah, if anybody has any more, but otherwise, thank you so much. And I don't know why, Allison, we didn't think, I should have tried that out beforehand. I'm very sorry. That was embarrassing and frustrating. So, because I have the presentation all ready to go, I just couldn't get it on the screen. So
we'll call it a learning experience. If anyone missed part of this, I'm going to edit it, and hopefully I can get it up next week on the library's YouTube page. So it's, I think, YouTube/myFCPL. And once again, thank you to Mr. Woods, and thank you to everyone who participated in this event. As a reminder, again, it is part of our Friends of the Frankfort Library annual meeting. We have the exhibit running in the art gallery, and we would like to again give our thanks to the Indiana Humanities in cooperation with the National Endowment for the Humanities, VFW Post number 1110, Industrial Federal Credit Union and Compass Credit Union, Gongwer Powers Insurance, and Skiles Electric Incorporated, and also to Mindy, who works at the library, who did a fantastic job, as always, putting together the Friends of the Frankfort Library annual meeting events and contacting Mr. Woods.
yeah, I'd echo that. Thank you, Mindy.
And if you would like to read the book, it is of course available to purchase, but we have it available at the library as well. So thank you to everyone for coming out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.